Well, welcome back. We are now venturing into the world of concepts with Major General Darrell Amison. Darrell is a logistician, although I believe, according to your Wikipedia page, you started as an educator. Is that correct?
That's very good research.
That's the first time I've ever heard Wikipedia actually validated, so that's really good news. Major Darrell has had operational tours in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan, commanded 102 Logistics Brigade, and then ultimately becoming the Army's head of logistics, engineering, and medical capability. General Darrell is now the director of the Development Concepts and Doctrine Center, DCDC, and he's going to have a chat about current challenges and next generation issues. Sir, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. And may I say at the outset, it's a real pleasure to join you here for this really important and I think fascinating conference. I'm a generalist. I'm not a specialist, of course, in space, but I think what I realize is just how important this domain is. And that's what I want to try and do over the next 20 minutes or so, is to position the importance of space within defense's integrated operating concept, but also within multi-domain integration as well. Because I would probably contend that the space domain, along with the cyber and electromagnetic domain, really does sit at the heart of what we're trying to do in terms of multi-domain integration. So I'm going to sort of take a step back slightly from some of the depth and from the experts that we've heard this morning and talk about a little bit about the strategic context, a little bit about threats. I want to position space within the integrated operating concept in MDI, and then just finish on space power, really, and how space power contributes, I believe, to the integrated operating concept and much of the activity that defense is undertaking. I should add, it's a real pleasure to be doing this with the partners that we have in this room and on the online audience. As we heard this morning, collaboration is so important, in particular, I think, in this domain, in terms of industry and our international colleagues. So it's a real privilege to be able to connect with many of you. And these events are always good because it encourages one to reflect. And the reflection that I've had, I think, in preparing for this, and in listening to those brilliant speeches this morning, is just how impressive the work that Harv and Goddard, and I appreciate it's a much wider team, it's a collaborative effort, but the work that has gone on to develop at the pace we have over the last couple of years or so, I think is truly, truly impressive. And I just commend Harv and Goddard and everybody for the tremendous work that has taken place within this domain. I've got some pre-prepared marks. I'll sort of read those, we'll go through those, and hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions, or I might draw in some of the experts during the Q&A session, so that's my get out of jail card. But of course, for many, all of you really in this room, it's not a surprise that space is a domain of increased conceptual as well as practical focus, and noting Harv's point this morning that actually it is about getting on and doing this now. You know, this isn't, I'm not going to talk here about some theoretical concept. It is about getting on and doing this as well, but I want to set it within that conceptual framework. As you all know, it connects the world's population and relays vital information to power the global economy. And indeed, UK societal resilience depends on assured access to space. I think you know that. Satellites can be thought of as networked computers. And I would contend that space and cyber are now integrated in a way that space and cyber are integrated with so much else, both in our sort of commercial, private, and defense lives. As we've heard, I think, from General Dickinson earlier on, a day without space would plunge us back into the 1950s and render us, to a large extent, deaf, dumb, and blind. It's worth thinking about. But space, again, as we've heard this morning, is a rapidly evolving domain with the growth of actors, both commercial and nation state. Why is this? Well, I think access to space has become easier due to cheaper and more frequent launch opportunities, due to the deployment of mega constellations, such as Starlink, as we heard about this morning, and also reusable capabilities. We're seeing the space domain, as Harv said, to become more competitive, congested, and contested. And here's the first bit of theory. as theoretically infinite it may be, space, like the maritime environment, shares the phenomenon of choke points. And again, I think as we heard this morning, there are in practice only a few orbits that attract heavy traffic. And one could also consider limited launch sites as ground-based choke points as well. But space also sits at the heart, along with the cyber and electromagnetic domain, really at the heart of our multi-domain integration efforts. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Next slide, please. So just a little bit on the strategic context, stepping back from the phrase slightly. The integrated review, the Defence Command paper, and actually reflected in the National Space Strategy, the Defence Space Strategy, recognises a context that appears increasingly complex, dynamic, and competitive. We call this an era of systemic competition, in which liberalism is under attack. We witness this today, of course, in Ukraine. We face the challenges of geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts, transnational challenges such as climate change, biosecurity, risks, terrorism, serious and organized crime. And the pervasiveness of information and the pace of technological change are transforming the character of warfare. And we see that very evidently, I think, within space capabilities in the space domain. So in this multipolar world, our authoritarian rivals, and let's call them out, Russia and China, engage in a continuous struggle involving all the instruments of statecraft, ranging from what we call peace to nuclear war. Their strategy of political warfare is designed to undermine cohesion, to erode economic, political, and social resilience, and to compete for strategic advantage in key regions of the world. Now, notwithstanding the current Russian offensive in Ukraine, their broad goal is to win without fighting, to achieve their objectives by breaking our willpower, using attacks below the threshold that would prompt a warfighting response. Now, this probably is stretching our understanding of the definition of warfare well beyond the narrow boundaries within which our traditional approach can hope to succeed, certainly within the narrow boundaries that I spent most of my military career, certainly those formative years within. Next slide, please. So let's just focus for a moment on the threats with a bead to the counter-space continuum here. So again, a central paradox really of our information age is that the greater a society's digital capacity, the more vulnerable it becomes. And of course, the same is true of defense and of the space domain. So given the identified dependence on space and the potential range of threats shown on the slide here, noting that we're not showing, if you will, the sort of hazards, these are the threats. So we're not showing space debris, we're not showing space weather, for instance. Given these threats, a fundamental goal of the UK's national space strategy, as God has mentioned, is to protect and defend our national interests in and through space. And such protection must cover all three segments: the space segment, the ground segment, and the link segment. Indeed, I would perhaps contend that through the ability to exploit ambiguity, plausible deniability, and avoiding the costs of a kinetic attack on the space segment and the ensuing space debris that would follow, I sense it's probably the link in the ground segments that are perhaps at greatest risk of attack. There's not particularly evidence around that apart from general research and reading that I've done, but it's an interesting thought, I think. Our ability to understand the future battle space will be challenged further as adversaries develop advanced networked sensor technologies, passive detection systems, quantum sensing, and counter-ISR and counter-PNT position, navigation, and timing capabilities. Next slide, please. A number of commentators this morning spoke about the destruction of Cosmos 1408. This had been launched, I think, in the height of the Cold War, this particular Russian spy satellite. It was inactive, really, it's been inactive since about 1984, and as you're aware, it was destroyed by that direct ascent missile attack in November. This is what the Secretary of State had to say about it. 1,500 trackable pieces of debris, as we heard before lunch, and certainly the ISS staff forced to take precautionary avoidance measures. These are challenges. And of course, the irony in this is that no laws were broken. And this is the point that we heard about this morning from General Dickinson and others about the importance of the establishment of norms and the principles of responsible behavior within space. And I think it's fantastic that the FCDO and the UK are taking a lead with that UN initiative. I was listening to Michelle Hanlon, who's an eminent air and space lawyer recently from the University of Mississippi, who described this particular incident as a wake-up call. And of course, since then, we had Vice President Kamala Harris's statement on the 18th of April that the Americans would not any longer be testing direct ascent capabilities. But certainly this puts a real focus, I think, on those norms of the road and the principles for responsible behavior. Other allegations have been made about Russian meddling with the radar signature from Sentinel-1, which is a European space agency, part of the ESA constellation, which has been used to provide images of the Russian buildup in and around Ukraine. So this is today. This is not something in the future, as you're all aware. Next slide, please. And again, China, again, I think as most people in this audience are aware, this is the CSIS's assessment, have significant counter space capabilities. Just give you a moment to read that. Next slide, please. Of course, what those previous slides don't reflect are the potential capabilities of middle powers, or indeed non-state actors, to interfere with those space, but in particular the link and the ground segments of space capabilities. So how are we responding in terms of UK defence? First of all, I think within the IR, the Integrated Review, the Defence Command paper, and the integrated operating concept, we're clear that our response will be more strategic and it will be more integrated. And it will require significant modernization of our armed forces and other capabilities. For the pace of technological change means we must move from an industrial age of platforms to an information age of systems. That isn't to say there isn't a role for platforms. Of course there is. It's one of emphasis and shifting trend. The central idea of the UK's integrated operating concept is to drive the conditions and tempo of strategic activity, rather than responding to the actions of others from a static, home-based posture of contingent response that typified most of my career in the army. This requires a new strategic culture in which we employ the military instrument to compete below the threshold of war, gaining advantage through offering a wider breadth of political choice and credible military options that can be threatened or used to break the will of our rivals, all of which done in partnership with allies and partners. So maximizing advantage will only be realized through being more integrated, and we refer to this as multi-domain integration. What do we mean by that? First of all, integrated horizontally across the 5 operational domains of the military instrument, so maritime, land, air, space, and cyber and electromagnetic. Vertically through the strategic, operational, and tactical levels, and across government and with our allies as well. Now, in the heart of that diagram is information advantage. I'm going to return to that very shortly. But in specific response to our adversaries' growing offensive capabilities in space that we just considered, we do require credible deterrence and response options. To protect and defend our national interests in and through space, response options will be multi-domain and span all instruments of power. Space domain awareness to anticipate, seek out, identify, analyze, attribute, and thus understand threats is vital, as is effective operational space control and resilient on-orbit terrestrial and cyber infrastructure. Next slide, please. Very, very quickly, I'm not going to dwell on this, but the integrated operating framework, which kind of operationalizes that horrible word, the concept, this provides a model really for that more assertive and active approach. in which the willingness in this model here to commit decisively hard capability with the credibility to warfight is an essential part of the ability to deter and compete more effectively below the threshold of war. Next slide, please. Fundamentally, though, the source of battlefield advantage will probably not come from platforms. The true source of battlefield advantage will come from our ability to sense, understand, and orchestrate, a point that was made earlier on by the speaker from Maxell. And it's sensing, understanding, and orchestrating across domains at a tempo that is faster than the enemy. Christian Brose put this as creating and closing kill chains. And this really requires a digital force that is software defined but hardware enabled, perhaps rather than the other way around. A force that harnesses pervasive sensors, resilient networks, cloud and edge computing, one that applies machine learning and artificial intelligence to exploit data, support decision-making, and enable expendable autonomous systems and swarming. Now, to do this continuously better than our adversaries requires sustained information advantage. So I'm coming back now to what was at the heart of our response, this importance of information advantage. And I would contend that the IR investments lay the foundations of this force, specifically the digital backbone and the defense space portfolio, because it is all about the sensing, the collection, and the use of information across the whole force. Next slide, please. Now, roles of space are shown here. Space power, by which we mean the exerting of influence in, from, or through space, offers persistent access to any point on Earth. It represents the ultimate high ground. And it is vital to achieving multi-domain integration's key tenet of information advantage. Space power is integrated across the strategic to tactical level and has utility across all of the functions of that integrated operating framework: protect, engage, constrain, and warfight. It also services, of course, all instruments of power: diplomacy, economic power, and information. I would describe it as a vital, always-on, 360-degree operational domain. Now, to bring this to life, the head doctrine in DCDC, Air Commodore Finn Monaghan, was recently seconded to the NATO Air Component Command in Ramstein, Germany. This was in support of NATO's ramping up of its air operations on the eastern flank of NATO following Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. So Finn was out there for about 4 to 5 weeks. When Finn came back, really interesting to hear his thoughts on air power, because actually I was expecting a discussion on air power specifically, but actually he said, no, this is a discussion on multi-domain integration, and in particular the way that space acted as a glue to enable that multi-domain integration. I've got a 2 to 3 minute clip now. Unfortunately, the picture of Finn is, in fact, no, we have got a picture of Finn. I think next slide, please. And if we run the video, Finn's talking for about 3 minutes or so on his thoughts, having been in that JFAC in March, early April of this year.
I'm Air Commodore Finn Monaghan, head of Doctrine, Air, Space and Cyber at DCDC. I recently returned from a short notice posting as a director of the Joint Force Air Component in NATO Air Command at Ramstein. Whilst there, I was running air operations across NATO airspace in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And given this recent experience, General Amison has asked me to give you a snapshot of the degree to which space capabilities and considerations are applicable to and integrated with modern air operations. In the last 20 years, GPS has transformed navigation and targeting. Navigating air assets is now a great deal easier than when I started my career. And space technology allows us to establish very accurate target locations that enable precision attacks and reduce the number of assets and weapons required for a specific target. Meanwhile, satellite communication links are fundamental to modern air operations, allowing us to exploit real-time intelligence, surveillance and recce feeds from our air assets, and, of course, to maintain our UAV control links. Space-derived information helps us build a recognised air picture and to fuse our radars, battle space managers, ground-based air defence systems, aircraft carriers, air defence systems and ships, combat air patrols and quick reaction alert aircraft. This is called our Integrated Air and Missile Defence System, and it provides a 24/7 system providing what SACEUR describes as a 360-degree protection for the circa 1 billion people across the 30 nations of the Alliance. The whole thing is underpinned by space technologies. Understanding where our own and adversary satellites are and what they will be able to see and when is particularly important in the air domain. Thus, terrestrial and space weather briefings are part of our daily business, as is understanding and briefing of the locations of friendly and adversary satellites as we plan our operations. So space is so important to military operations as well as all aspects of modern life. And defending the fixed infrastructure on Earth that allows space activities to take place is absolutely critical. Air power plays a significant role in this, and it is a major consideration in the planning of our integrated air and missile defence system. Hopefully, this has given you a very brief snapshot about how integrated space is in modern air operations, but also how important integration is across all of the domains.
But I hope a sense of the ubiquitous relevance of space across all of those domains. And I think, the other counter to that, of course, is that the more that one has an advantage in space, the more that, of course, it becomes attractive to an adversary to, in some way, disrupt or degrade or even destroy some of that capability. So, as ever, that counter piece is really important as we think about space, and the point that God has made about protection and defend is so important. But by connecting and fueling the military Internet of Things, space has this amplifying effect. It enables understanding, it allows critically forces to concentrate effects from a dispersed, networked posture, and facilitates the potential to be more decisive through lethal or non-lethal precision effects at greater reach. That is a really important part of a trend which I think we will see grow, and space is enabling that. By the same token, the other side of the coin, space-based ISR as a component of a multi-domain ISR system makes it extremely difficult to hide. And again, just think about this morning, as we heard from Robert John and Volodymyr, how commercial and military space imagery has exposed the Russian buildup around Ukraine and the subsequent atrocities. And we saw those slides from Bucha this morning. Space also makes an important contribution to deterrence. And I want to sort of pick up the theme that General Dickinson raised this morning. Treated as a global common, the Outer Space Treaty established the right of overflight from space and can provide ubiquitous and pervasive surveillance. Put simply, it can provide and promote truth and help avoid miscalculation and unintended escalation. Of course, and we've witnessed this, in the wrong hands, it can also be manipulated for malign purposes. In addition to space enabling the projection of power through deterrence by punishment, including the nuclear deterrent, deterrence by denial protects and defends space capabilities by increasing the resilience of space infrastructure, potentially through things such as hardening targets against jamming, encrypting data links against spoofing or exploitation, developing responsive launch options for small satellites, terrestrial alternatives to space capabilities such as position navigation and timing signals, or improving the security of ground stations against physical or cyber attack, including the insider threat. Broadening the range of available space assets also helps build resilience, as does expanding the range to include alliance or commercial capabilities and diversifying supply chains for key components. Indeed, effective and efficient space power requires the closest possible international and commercial collaboration, which, as you've heard, is the approach that the UK is taking. We will strengthen bilateral and multilateral relations with our Five Eyes partners, particularly the US as our primary partner, but also through the Combined Space Operations Initiative, and of course NATO. Doing so will help us to learn and protect our space interests, build stability, increase resilience, and deter conflict from extending into space. Let me now sort of draw this to a conclusion in terms of just trying to sort of think ahead a little bit, albeit I think it is quite murky. But just as control of the air, I would argue, is essential for successful warfighting today, just think about the Russians for a moment in Ukraine. That was probably not necessarily well understood in the interwar years 100 years ago, when the future of air power was uncertain in terms of its detail. But theorists at the time predicted with total confidence that the future must witness ever more diverse and significant use, leading both to new dependencies and new forms of warfare. I think much the same can be said today about space power 100 years on. Whilst the details are probably murky at best, future warfare will include, at the very least, operations to contest the control of space, because the use of space in war has become vital. It's a trend that cannot be reversed. I'll pause there, but thank you very much indeed for your time and attention. I don't know, there might just be 2 or 3 minutes, Mark. Do you want to take, or do you want to go into the panel, or?
No, see if there is any questions in the room.
So I might be drawing on my space experts, so there are some difficult questions, but.
Dave Davis from ST Engineering. With the global chip shortage, you were talking about having diversified supply chains, but the vast majority of those chips are coming from 1 or 2 sources, and we're seeing now car manufacturers that are buying thousands of washing machines to strip them down and get the chips out of them. How do you see that in the future, particularly for UK? How do we get around that?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, of course, and it's a broader question, of course, than simply space capabilities. You appreciate that, anyone trying to order a new car over the last 2 years may well have suffered supply chain problems. I mean, I think one of the discussions that was taking place a year or 2 ago, and of course the pandemic has really catalyzed some of these discussions, it was this refocusing really on supply chain resilience. And I think some of the discussions I've heard have been about more onshoring. And to an extent, there's a link here with the DCIS in terms of those strategic imperatives that we've identified as capabilities and those in which we require operational dependence. And you're sort of in that territory with some of the semiconductors. But I think the more that I've personally looked into this, and this is not a defense position, it's my own view, I concur with the view I think that I heard this morning, which is the trick to this is not to just go sovereign with everything. You've got to collaborate. The world is more complex. The world remains quite globalized. Yes, there'll be certain things that we want to do with strategic capabilities from a more sovereign perspective, but I think the trick here is to broaden the diversification of supply if it's possible. But I do accept, in the case of semiconductors, it's pretty limited. Taiwan here, of course, is so important. So I'm probably not addressing the question, Dave, as thoroughly as I would hope to, but I mean, you've put your finger on a critical issue, which is a much broader point, I think, than space. How do we secure access to those key components? And I do think the government is putting a lot of effort into that at the moment.
And we are now time's up.
Sorry, we are.
So thank you very much, General.
Thank you, Mark.
Thought-provoking presentation and a good seed, actually, for a lot of the discussion that we're going to have in the next 24 hours or so. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.